Beneath the heavy branches of the old magnolia trees, the deep south breathes like a dream half-remembered. The air is thick with memory, sweet with honeysuckle, heavy with history, and humming with the sound of crickets that might just be whispering. Secrets from another century. Here, stories don't shout. They linger, in the creak of a porch swing, the rustle of Spanish moss, the distant hum of a blues guitar drifting through the night. This is the land of beauty and contradiction, where sunlight paints golden halos on old plantation ruins, and shadows stretch long across the fields that once shaped a nation. Tonight, we'll wander slowly through the deep south, through the songs, the sorrow, the laughter, and the legends, tracing the stories whispered through moss and magnolia. And if you find yourself drifting to sleep as we wander, that's all right. Do. Because here at Sleepy Dreamer in America, the stories are meant to both teach and soothe. So, take a breath. Let the crickets sing and the magnolias sway. And if you enjoy this journey through America's deep and dreaming heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another midnight story. They call it the Deep South, a phrase that feels less like a direction and more like a spell. You don't just go south, you sink into it, cross the Mason-Dixon line, and it's as if the air itself changes, thicker, slower, sweeter, somehow. The highways stretch out like lazy ribbons across green fields, and even the time seems to hesitate before moving on. But the Deep South isn't one thing. It's 1,000 stories stitched together, of triumph and tragedy, laughter and loss, all humming under the same humid sky. From the bayous of Louisiana to the red clay of Georgia, the South is geography with a personality. It leans toward the poetic, a land that feels alive. In Mississippi, the river curls like a serpent, its muddy waters holding secrets of centuries. In Alabama, pine forests whisper to one another when the wind moves slow enough. And in the Carolinas, the coast breathes, the tide pulling in echoes of ships long gone. Even the soil tells stories here. That red earth, rich, warm, stubborn, once fed the cotton that built empires. But it also drank the sweat and tears of those who were never free to call it their own. You can't talk about the Deep South without talking about memory. It's everywhere, carved into old gravestones tucked behind church pews and whispered through front porches where old folks still talk about how things used to be. The South has always lived in contradiction. It's the birthplace of gospel and the blues, and also of Jim Crow. It's where hospitality can feel like an art form, but where history still aches like a bruise. It's a place of both faith and defiance, where Sunday sermons and Saturday moonshine often come from the same hands. And maybe that's what makes it so hauntingly beautiful. The South is never just one thing. It's light and shadow, heaven and heartbreak, all tangled together beneath the magnolia trees. Even the weather plays along. Storms that roll in like drama queens, lightning flashing over old steeples, thunder rumbling through the fields like some divine commentary. If the South had a soul, it would sing. Long before the radio, before records, before anything could be played back, the South was its own soundtrack. In the heat of the day, you might hear the rhythmic hum of a field hand's song, rising like prayer. At night, the sound of fiddles, guitars, and tambourines would echo across porches, blending pain and joy in equal measure. The blues were born from that, from resilience, from heartbreak, from centuries of turning suffering into sound. Later, jazz found its roots in New Orleans. Gospel filled the churches, and country music rose from Appalachian hollers. All of it, all those sounds, are stitched into the South's heartbeat. Even now, you can feel it in the air. The way a screen door slams in rhythm, or the way Sikadashim like a low, eternal chorus. To understand the South, you have to understand its people. Storytellers, every one of them. They can turn an afternoon thunderstorm into a saga, and a pie and biscuit recipe into family legend. It's a place that holds on to its people, even when they try to leave. Ask anyone who grew up there. The South never really lets go. There's always something pulling you back. Maybe it's the food. Maybe it's the family. Maybe it's that deep sense of belonging to something older than yourself. There's warmth there, a hospitality that feels almost sacred. But beneath that warmth lies a history that burns, a past full of contradictions, pride, and paint, that still shapes the present. At night, the South feels different. The world slows to a lullaby. Frogs croak like bass notes. Fireflies flicker like gentle punctuation marks in the dark. It's the kind of night where you can almost hear time itself sigh. Some say that's just the humidity. Others say it's the ghosts. Because if any place is haunted, not just by spirits but by stories, it's here. The Deep South holds on to its past like a locket. Every mansion, every church, every back road seems to whisper something, if you listen long enough. And so begins our journey through those whispers, through the centuries of dreams, disasters, and determination that shaped this vast, complicated soul of America. Next, we'll wander deeper, into the cotton fields and the Grand Row, illusions that once built a kingdom here, and the people who carried that kingdom on their backs. They called it King Cotton, a royal title for a plant, small, white, delicate, and devastating. By the early 1800s, cotton was not just a crop, it was a crown. The Deep South became its kingdom, a realm of wealth and power built on fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, and on backs that carried burdens unimaginable. The South grew rich, richer than anyone could have dreamed. But that wealth was woven from tragedy, because behind every elegant plantation column, behind every ball gown and silver spoon, there were lives bound in chains. The story of King Cotton begins with a man and a machine, Eli Whitney and his cotton gin, invented in 1793. A simple device with teeth of wire and wood it could separate cotton fiber from seed at a speed that turned farming into fortune. It changed everything. Almost overnight, the Deep South transformed from a sleepy rural corner into the engine of America's economy. Cotton became the lifeblood of not just the South, but the entire world, feeding the mills of England, clothing the cities of the North, and filling the pockets of planters from Georgia to Mississippi. By 1860, cotton made up nearly 2/3 of all U.S. exports. They said the South could survive without the Union, but the Union couldn't survive without Southern cotton. It was the great illusion of independence, and it came at a terrible cost to the world. The plantation was a picture of Southern grandeur, white-columned mansions framed by oak-lined drives, sweet tea poured on wide verandas, and parties that lasted until dawn. There were debutantes in lace, gentlemen in linen, and a rhythm to life that seemed almost romantic. But it was a romance written by the few and paid for by the many. The plantation was not a dream. It was a system. Every brick, every crop, every gleaming floorboard was built by enslaved hands. And for those who lived and worked in those fields, the South was not a home. It was a prison under open skies. Imagine the fields in August, the sky air thick and wet, the sun relentless. The cotton plants rise waist-high, their white bowls gleaming like cruel stars against a sea of green. Before dawn, the enslaved were driven out, sacks over shoulders, fingers bleeding, their lives measured in pounds of picked cotton. Men, women, and children worked until night, their songs rising above the fields, soft at first, then stronger, carrying messages and memories. Those songs, call and response, sorrow and hope intertwined, became something sacred. They were both survival and defiance, a rhythm of endurance that would echo for centuries, in gospel, blues, and jazz. The cotton might have been king, but the true heart of the South beat in those who endured it. The planters who grew rich from cotton didn't just see themselves as farmers. They saw themselves as nobility, Southern aristocrats, with codes of honor and hospitality that would make a knight blush. They built grand estates and sent their sons to study in Europe, quoting Shakespeare by candlelight and Jefferson at dinner. But beneath the polished manners was fear, a deep, unspoken knowledge that their power rested on a fragile foundation, human bondage, and so they guarded it fiercely. Slavery wasn't just an institution, it was their economy, their culture, their very identity. They told themselves it was God's will, that it was natural, that it was necessary, but deep down they knew. Kingdoms built on suffering rarely stand forever. Not everyone in the South believed the illusion. There were preachers who whispered that slavery was sin, writers who dared to tell the truth, and abolitionists who risked their lives to help others. Escape. Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, led dozens to freedom through the Underground Railroad, moving silently through woods and swamps that once trapped the enslaved. Frederick Douglass, born in chains, used words sharper than any blade to expose the cruelty of the system. And even some Southerners, like the Grimke sisters of Charleston, spoke out, defying their families, their society, and their own privilege. But for every voice of conscience, there were hundreds silenced by fear, by violence, by the comfort of denial. By the 1850s, the South was both rich and restless. Cotton money flowed like rivers, but so did rumors of rebellion. The North was changing, factories rising, railroads stretching, cities growing faster than anyone could count. And in the halls of Congress, voices clashed over tariffs, territory, and the question that would break a nation. Should slavery expand, or should it end? Southerners feared losing their way of life. Northerners feared losing their soul. And between them the cotton fields waited, silent witnesses to a storm building just beyond the horizon. Plantation owners spoke of honor and glory, of heritage and tradition. But beneath all the rhetoric, what they really feared was change. They saw progress as threat, freedom as chaos, equality as ruin, and so they doubled down, tightening their grip on the institution that defined them, even as the rest of the world began to turn away. In England, abolitionists filled the streets. In the North, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 500,000 copies, turning quiet dinner conversations into moral crusades. And in the South, they banned the book, as if paper and ink could be stopped by fear. Still, the stories spread, and the kingdom of cotton began to tremble, its roots loosening in the red soil. By 1860, the South stood at its height, and on the edge of collapse. Plantations glittered like jewels, the economy seemed invincible, and the politicians spoke of destiny. But history has a quiet way of reminding us, empires that rise from injustice carry the seeds of their own undoing. The storm clouds gathered, literal and political, over the fields of cotton. Whispers of secession grew louder, and the same men who toasted their fortunes now spoke of war. They believed they were fighting for freedom, but in truth they were fighting for a way of life built on chains. And soon the land that had given them so much would burn, not from the sun, but from the fire of their own making. Next, we'll walk through that fire, into the thunder and heartbreak of the Civil War itself, the war that tore the Deep South apart and left behind ghosts that still wander its fields. Every nation has its music, but in the Deep South the music was the nation. It was the heartbeat beneath the fields, the hum beneath the chains, the sound of a people whore-fused to be silenced. Before America could even spell freedom, the enslaved were already singing it. Music was more than melody. It was language, code, memory. In the fields, the overseer might have heard a simple work song, keeping rhythm with the picking of cotton. But to the people singing it, that same song carried message and a warning, a prayer, a plan, wade in the water. They'd sing softly, and those who listened closely knew. It was a signal to escape that night, to follow the river, to move quietly where dogs could not track their scent. Others sang, "Steal away to Jesus," which sounded like devotion, but meant something far braver. Steal away tonight. Freedom waits. Every verse was a lifeline, every chorus a kind of rebellion, disguised as worship, disguised as work. Through rhythm and repetition, they built something no master could own, their humanity. In the small cabins after dark, voices rose again, different this time. Children hummed lullabies their mothers had brought from Africa. Though no one remembered the words anymore, drums were forbidden, too dangerous. They carried power. They carried communication. So the people made rhythm with what they had. Feet on dirt, hands on wood, spoons on tin. There is something extraordinary about that kind of creation, to build beauty out of nothing but breath and will. That is the origin of so much Southern sound. Gospel, blues, soul, jazz, all born from those first songs in the dark. They were more than music. They were memory given rhythm. A quiet declaration. We are still here. Most rebellions in history are fought with weapons. This one was fought with voices. Of course, there were uprisings too. Nat Turner in Virginia, Denmark Vesey in Charleston. Men who rose against impossible odds, trying to shatter the system with sheer courage. Their rebellions were crushed, their names nearly erased. But their defiance planted something deeper, an idea that could not be whipped or sold or silenced. And while some fought with fire, others fought with faith. Churches became sanctuaries, secret places where sermons carried double meanings, salvation in one breath, revolution in the next. The preacher's voice might tremble with the Holy Spirit, but the spirit he meant was freedom. Every amen was a heartbeat of resistance. Every hallelujah was a promise. Someday, the last chain will break. By the 1830s and 1840s, these songs, these spirituals, began to drift beyond the plantations. Travelers wrote of their haunting harmonies. Abolitionists printed the lyrics as evidence of both pain and brilliance. They were unlike anything the Western world had heard. Sorrow and strength intertwined, grief and grace in perfect balance. Even those who didn't understand the words could feel it, that deep ache that sat somewhere between hope and heartbreak. These were the songs that would become the spiritual DNA of American music. The bluesman's wail, the gospel choir's shout, the soul singer's cry. All of it began here in those whispers through the moss, beneath the magnolia, beneath the moon. But the songs could not drown out the thunder forever. By the late 1850s, the nation was tearing itself apart. The question of slavery, that long, festering wound, had become impossible to ignore. In 1859, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a mass rebellion. He failed, but his execution sent shockwaves through both North and South. Church bells tolled for him in Boston. Curses echoed for him in Charleston. The divide was no longer a crack, it was a canyon. And then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, a man who believed slavery must not spread. The South saw it as a death sentence, state by state. They seceded, their leaders declaring the old Union broken. The war that followed would test not just a nation, but the soul of the South itself. In April 1861, the first cannon roared over Fort Sumter, and the South, proud, defiant, unprepared, marched into history. Young men rushed to enlist, dreaming of glory. They carried flags and fiddles, letters and promises, and they believed, oh, they believed, that honor would see them through. But cotton could not stop bullets, and courage could not feed armies. The fields that had once grown profit now grew graves, and the very land that had been soaked in sweat was now soaked in blood. The songs of the enslaved changed too. They became prayers for deliverance, for survival, for victory. Many found their way into the Union Army itself, because when freedom called, thousands answered. Over 180,000 black men served in the Union forces, many of them former slaves. They fought not just for a flag, but for a future. At Port Hudson, Fort Wagner, Petersburg, they stood shoulder to shoulder facing cannons, muskets, and centuries of hate. When they sang not of sorrow, but of triumph. Go down, Moses, and when Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Their music became anthems for a cause larger than any one army, the sound of humanity, demanding its own dignity. Meanwhile, Confederate soldiers sang too, songs of home, of mothers, of magnolias waiting back in Georgia. For them, the war was personal. For the enslaved, it was eternal. When the war finally ended in 1865, it didn't end with a cheer. It ended with a sigh, weary, heavy, like the deep exhale of a land that had seen too much. News of emancipation spread slowly, like dawn creeping across a long night. In Texas, it took months before the last enslaved people even heard they were free. That day, June 19, 1865, became Juneteenth, a holiday of joy and tears that still carries the echo of that first breath of freedom. The songs changed again, from laments to celebration, from mourning to movement, from bondage to becoming. But the scars did not fade overnight. Freedom came. Yes, but equality lagged behind, limping through the ruins of war. In the years after the war, a new South began to sing. Freedmen built churches, opened schools, started newspapers. They voted, they taught, they led. For a brief, shining moment, they believed a new world was possible. And through it all, the music carried them forward. Spirituals turned into hymns of progress. Blues began to rise from the Delta, telling stories of heartbreak and humor. And in dusty church halls, the first echoes of jazz began to stir. From sorrow came sound. From oppression came art. From the darkest corners of history came the light of creativity. It was as if the Deep South at long last was learning to sing a truer song, one of resilience rather than regret. The old Cotton Kingdom had fallen, but from its ashes a different kind of South began to grow, raw, restless, reborn. Next, we'll step into that uncertain dawn, a South rebuilding itself, wrestling with guilt and glory, faith and fear, the story of Reconstruction and ruin. The war was over, but the silence that followed was louder than any cannon. The fields lay empty now, no cotton, no soldiers, just wind moving through tall grass and broken fences, longer the same. The magnolia trees bloomed as they always did, but beneath their shade the South was no. They said the war ended in 1865. But in truth, the Deep South never stopped fighting, not with muskets and bayonets, but with memory, pride, and pain. Imagine walking down a southern road in the summer of 1865. The air is still, thick with the smell of earth and smoke. Everywhere you look, there are ghosts, not seen but felt. The mansions stand empty, windows shattered, porches sagging. Church bells ring not in celebration, but in mourning. And across the countryside, widows wear black like a second skin. It's hard to describe the scale of it. How much was gone? Cities burned, fields ruined, families divided by loyalty and loss. Nearly 1 in 5 Southern men of fighting age was dead. Entire towns became graveyards without fences. And yet, the world kept spinning. The magnolias kept blooming. Life, stubborn, slow, Southern life, began to stir again. Many of the words we know from that time come from letters, ink smudged by rain and tears. A young Confederate soldier writes, home from Vicksburg, telling his mother he still dreams of the sound of crickets by their porch. A woman in Savannah describes the city as quiet as Sunday, but every day. Another letter, unsigned, found in a burned farmhouse, reads simply, "We have lost everything but our stories." Perhaps that is enough. Those stories became the South's new inheritance. Not land, not wealth, but memory. And memory, when nurtured long enough, grows into legend. There's a saying that the South is haunted. But maybe it's not by ghosts. Maybe it's by grief. Every family had someone who never came home. And when the living didn't know where the dead were buried, they made graves in their minds. Empty chairs, silent places at the table. The war's dead did not rest quietly. They lingered, in photographs on mantels, in names carved into marble. In the quiet way, people avoided speaking of the worst days. You can still feel them in places like Shiloh, Gettysburg, Chickamauga. Fields that bloom now with wildflowers, but beneath the roots, bones. The South became a cemetery wrapped in sunlight, and yet it smiled, because that's what the South does. It grieves and grins in the same breath. As the smoke cleared, a new story began to take shape, a comforting one. The South, it was said, hadn't lost the war of honor. It had simply been overwhelmed, noble in defeat, righteous in cause. It was a myth called the lost cause, and it grew fast, watered by sorrow and denial. In this myth, the war was not about slavery, but about states' rights. The generals were not defenders of bondage, but heroes of chivalry. Plantations were painted as paradise, the enslaved as faithful servants. It was a rewriting of history, dressed up in magnolia and moonlight. It helped the South heal, or at least pretend to heal, because sometimes people will believe a lie if it hurts less than the truth. And so the lost cause took root, in songs, in textbooks, in statues that would stand for more than a century. It became the South's most successful story, and its heaviest chain. But the truth of Reconstruction was far from romantic. Cities like Atlanta, Columbia, and Richmond were ash and rubble. Railroads twisted like ribbon, plantations abandoned to weeds. Money was worthless, pride was not. Former slaves wandered roads in search of family, of freedom, of a future. Former masters sat on porches stunned, watching a world they thought eternal crumble before their eyes. And yet, there was a strange kind of beauty in the ruin. The South began to rebuild itself not with gold, but with grit. Women took over farms. Black soldiers became voters. Children went to schools built by hands once chained. Out of the ashes rose resilience, quiet, stubborn, sacred. Even today, you can walk through the old battlefields and feel the air thicken, as if time itself refuses to move on. At dusk, the fireflies flicker like candlelight over unmarked graves. Locals say you can still hear drums on humid nights, or footsteps in the tall grass where soldiers fell. But the truest ghosts are not the soldiers. They're the questions left behind. What was it all for? What did freedom mean, when half the nation still feared it? And how do you rebuild a home when its foundation is guilt? The South never truly answered those questions. It just learned to live with them, like one learns to live with a scar. The stories of that era, of bravery and betrayal, loss and love, became the South's greatest export after cotton. Into art writers like William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor would later turn that haunted inheritance. They called it Southern Gothic. Beauty born from decay, faith tangled with fear. Every cracked church bell, every creaking porch swing, every ghostly mansion became a metaphor for the region itself, proud, broken, and achingly human. Because the South didn't need ghosts to haunt it. History was haunting. Enough. In those years after the war, the Deep South became quieter. Sundays grew solemn. People spoke softly in churchyards where the moss hung low like mourning veils. And yet, there was peace in that stillness. Because even in grief, the South, who found rhythm, the slow healing of time, the hush before rebirth. The magnolia blossoms returned, the cicadas sang again, and the rivers, those patient witnesses, kept flowing. The land was tired, yes, but it was alive, and as history often does, it began to whisper of second chances. The war had ended, but the struggle was far from over. The South would soon face a new kind of battle, not fought with guns, but with laws, politics, and the fragile hope of equality. Next, we'll step into that uncertain chapter, when freedom was promised but not yet delivered, and when the South tried to rebuild itself from ruin. The story of Part 5, Reconstruction and Ruin. The guns had gone silent, but the South wasn't peaceful, it was just exhausted. In 1865, the Confederacy was gone, slavery was gone, and nearly everything else had gone with them. Fields lay untended, railroads twisted like metal vines, and cities that had once glowed with candlelight and cotton money now stood in ashes. They called it Reconstruction, a word that sounded simple, almost hopeful. But rebuilding a land is one thing. Rebuilding its conscience, that's something else, entirely. The end of the Civil War left America with a riddle it still hasn't quite solved. How do you heal a house divided when half its walls still refuse to admit they cracked? President Abraham Lincoln had a plan, gentle, forgiving, practical. He wanted the South welcomed back, not punished. But just days after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated, and with him died that fragile sense of mercy. His successor, Andrew Johnson, inherited the mess. A Southern man himself, but one who managed to make everyone, North and South, equally frustrated. He wanted rapid reunion, not justice. He pardoned Confederate leaders, turned a blind eye to black oppression, and called it healing. It was like trying to mend a wound by pretending it wasn't bleeding. For the 4 million newly freed people, emancipation was a miracle and a mystery. Freedom sounded beautiful, but what did it mean in practice? They had no land, no money, no protection, just hope, and the clothes they wore when they heard the news. Many walked for miles searching for families sold away years before. There are heartbreaking accounts of mothers finding children after decades, or learning they'd never return, and still they kept moving. In some towns, freedmen and women built new lives from scratch. They formed churches, opened schools, and founded newspapers with names like the Freedmen's Torchlight and the Colored Citizen. Education became the new liberation. For the first time, people could read the Bible for themselves, and history would never sound the same again. But freedom, without safety, is only half a gift. In the shadows, former Confederates were regrouping, bitter and broke, looking for someone to blame. In 1866, in a small Tennessee town called Pulaski, a group of ex-soldiers gathered for what they claimed was a fraternal order. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. At first, it was cloaked, quite literally, in absurdity. Men in sheets riding through towns to frighten people. But the laughter didn't last. The Klan grew into something darker, deadlier, an army of hate-wearing ghost costumes using fear as its weapon. Night after night, they rode against freedmen, teachers, politicians, anyone daring to live as equals. It wasn't just violence. It was a campaign to rewrite the world back into its old shape, to make the South's rebirth stillborn. And for a while, it nearly worked. But not everyone stood idle. In Washington, a group known as the Radical Republicans believed Reconstruction had to be bold, that freedom had to be enforced, not politely requested. They passed new laws, sent troops to protect freedmen, and demanded that Southern states rewrite their constitutions. For a time, the South saw something astonishing. Black men voting, holding office, and shaping their communities. In Saudi, Mississippi, Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. senator, taking the very seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. History, it seems, has a sly sense of humor. Schools flourished. Railroads reopened. The South was patching itself together, unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. And yet underneath it all, resentment simmered like summer heat before a storm. To many white Southerners, Reconstruction felt like occupation. Federal troops patrolled their streets. Northern businessmen arrived with briefcases and bold ideas. The locals called them carpetbaggers because they supposedly carried all their possessions in carpet-made bags, which, let's be honest, sounds itchy and impractical. Some were opportunists, sure, chasing profit in a wounded land. But others were genuine reformers, teachers, and dreamers. They worked alongside Southern whites who supported change. Men scornfully nicknamed scalawags, which is possibly the most charming insult ever invented. Together, these unlikely allies built bridges, literal and political, hoping to drag the South into a fairer century. But every bridge they built, someone tried to burn. By the 1870s, the South was beginning to look alive again. New industries rose where plantations had fallen. Steel in Birmingham, lumber in Louisiana, railroads. Cutting through pine and cotton country, cities bustled. Churches multiplied. But beneath that bustle was exhaustion, a deep, bone-tired weariness. The war had ended a decade ago, yet its shadow still lingered. Many Southerners longed for the old ways, for the myth of the grand plantation life that never truly existed. The lost cause story was spreading faster than progress. Monuments went up. Textbooks changed tone. Children grew up hearing not about the cruelty of slavery, but the honor of the Confederacy. It's strange how nostalgia can rebuild ruins faster than bricks ever could. In 1877, the final act of Reconstruction came quietly. No speeches, no gunfire, just a deal struck in the back rooms of politics. To settle a disputed presidential election, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Without that protection, the fragile structure of equality collapsed. White supremacists regained control of state governments, passing laws that would come to be known as Jim Crow. And just like that, freedom took a step backward. The promise of Reconstruction faded into segregation, lynching, and silence. The South had been rebuilt, but not reborn. By the turn of the century, you could still see the ghosts of Reconstruction everywhere. Old courthouses, half rebuilt, broken statues of soldiers, abandoned schools that once rang with laughter. Yet the spirit of that era, of possibility, of courage, of endurance, never died completely. It lived in the music of the Delta, in the sermons of the churches, in the quiet determination of people who refused to stop dreaming. Even in ruin, the South hummed. A low, steady tune, half sorrow, half survival. Reconstruction failed in its promises, but it planted seeds that would bloom later, much later. Every school built by freedmen, every vote cast in defiance, every hymn sung in hope became part of a longer arc, one that would one day curve toward civil rights. Sometimes history isn't about victory, it's about endurance, and the South, battered, divided, unrepentant yet unbroken, endured, because, even when all else burned away, the Deep South still had its oldest inheritance, the power to tell a story, and no story, no matter how painful, ever truly ends if someone keeps whispering it under them, magnolia trees. The South would rise again, yes, but not in the way anyone expected. From the ashes of Reconstruction came something stranger and more beautiful. Myths, legends, and moonlight, dreams. In the next chapter, we'll step into that dream itself, where truth and fiction intertwine beneath the Spanish moss, where the past becomes myth and the myth becomes comfort. The Civil War had ended, Reconstruction had faded, and the Deep South, left alone at last, began to do what it did best: tell stories. But these weren't just stories about soldiers or states. They were lullabies for a broken heart. Legends meant to soothe, to justify, to remember, and to forget. Around the turn of the 20th century, America fell in love with a fantasy. A South of gallant gentlemen, gracious ladies, sprawling plantations, and mint juleps on wide verandas. It was called the Old South. But truthfully, it never existed quite like that. The real South had been brutal, complex, deeply human. But the imagined South was simpler, sweeter, wrapped in satin and song. And so began an era of moonlight and magnolia, pour it on pancakes. A phrase so sticky with nostalgia you could writers and filmmakers painted the past in soft focus. Slavery became a background detail. Plantations became homes of honor. And history, well, history put on a white suit and smiled for the camera. It was the lost cause, dressed up for the ball. The lost cause wasn't just a belief, it was an act of emotional survival. To many, white Southerners, the war's defeat had been unbearable. A total loss of wealth, pride, and identity. So they began to retell the story in a way that made the pain noble, even romantic. In this new version, the South hadn't fought to keep people enslaved. It had fought for honor, heritage, states' rights, and its generals weren't traitors. They were tragic heroes, stoic and saintly, like Robert E. Lee on a marble pedestal, eternally gazing somewhere between heaven and denial. It was a myth that made loss bearable, and soon, it became more powerful than truth itself. The South's women became the myth's guardians. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy worked tirelessly to preserve a version of history that smelled faintly of lavender and selective memory. They raised funds for monuments, edited school books, and organized heritage days. They were not villains. They were mourners. But their mourning, wrapped in lace and scripture, shaped how generations would remember the war. Statues rose in courthouse squares across the South. Silent men on horseback, cast in bronze. They were meant to represent honor, courage, devotion. But to others, they stood as reminders of something much heavier, the rewriting of reality itself. A century later, those statues would become battlegrounds once again, because when you build your memory in metal, it never stays asleep. Out of this fog of nostalgia came something hauntingly beautiful: the Southern Gothic. It was the art of confronting decay with grace, of finding poetry in the broken. Writers like William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, and Flannery O'Connor began peeling back the layers of that magnolia-scented myth. They showed us the rot beneath the roses, the madness behind the manners. Faulkner wrote of families haunted by their own bloodlines. O'Connor gave us hypocrites, dreamers, and saints in the making. Tennessee Williams brought passion and ruin to every sweaty Southern porch. The Southern Gothic was, in many ways, the South's therapy, a way of whispering, "We know the truth. We just prefer it with metaphors. Every myth is a mirror." And the South, for all its storytelling, could never quite look away from its own reflection. In the mirror of the lost cause, the South saw beauty, honor, and pride. But it also saw guilt, poverty, and pain. That's the strange duality of the Deep South. It mourns what never was and fears what might be. It clings to the past with one hand and reaches for redemption with the other. Even its landscape seems to understand. The magnolia, after all, blooms only after surviving heat that would kill most flowers. The myth of the South became like that flower, resilient, fragrant, and full of thorns. By the early 1900s, the myth had gone national. Hollywood arrived, and it brought its cameras and charm. Films like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, turned Reconstruction into a horror movie with the Ku Klux Klan cast as saviors. And later, Gone with the Wind, 1939, turned the antebellum South into a dreamscape of sunsets and sorrow. Audiences wept. Scarlett O'Hara became an icon, and somewhere in that technicolor haze, millions of viewers confused fiction for fact. It's remarkable how one movie can do what 1,000 historians cannot. The myth of the lost cause wasn't harmless nostalgia. It shaped politics, race relations, and culture for generations. It justified segregation, defended inequality, and slowed progress. And even when it was told with sweetness and charm, its shadow lingered, in courthouse flags, in school curricula, in polite silence. But the South is nothing if not self-aware. Its humor, its melancholy, its music, they all carry an undertone of confession. It's as if the land itself knows. You can't romanticize a wound and expect it to heal. Still, the South never abandoned its sense of beauty. That strange, melancholy grace that makes you fall in love with a place even as it breaks your heart. You see it in Savannah's oak-lined cemeteries, in Charleston's faded pastel houses, in New Orleans, where jazz rises from cracks in the pavement like forgiveness set to a trumpet. Its beauty haunted by memory, a place where ghosts and living souls share the same porch swing, humming to the same tune. That's the Deep South, always whispering, always watching, always remembering. The lost cause may have been built on denial, but it also gave birth to a peculiar honesty. Because to sustain a myth that long, you must keep telling it over and over, until someone starts asking questions. And when they do, the truth slips out like a sigh. The South began quietly to confront its ghosts, through literature, through music, through generations willing to look beneath the magnolia petals and see the roots. Tangled, dark, human, the myth didn't die, but it changed shape. becoming less of a defense and more of a reckoning. Because maybe the South wasn't meant to forget. Maybe it was meant to remember, softly, painfully, beautifully. By mid-century, the South had become a land of paradox. Its stories were both lullabies and confessions, its beauty both comfort and warning. The lost cause still lingered, in statues, in slogans, in silence, but beneath it new voices were stirring, voices that spoke not of defeat or pride, but of justice and dignity. The South was about to wake up from its long, perfumed dream, and what it saw would change the world. Soft. Music fades. The tone settles into a hopeful calm. The magnolias were still blooming. The rivers still sang their songs. But this time, the whispers beneath the moss were different, clearer, stronger, no longer content to stay quiet. Next, we step into the century of voices, of gospel, jazz, protest, and courage, where the Deep South becomes not just a memory, but a movement. The 20th century crept into the Deep South not with fanfare, but with a sigh. The Civil War was a memory. Reconstruction was a rumor, and the region, battered and poetic as ever, was ready to reinvent itself. They called it the New South, a phrase full of promise, shiny, industrial, modern, like a fresh coat of paint on an old wooden porch. But paint doesn't change the wood beneath it. And the South, for all its new factories and railroads, was still wrestling with the ghosts of its own making. After the ashes of Reconstruction, cooled, the South wanted to prove itself, to the North, to the world, maybe even to its own reflection. So came the age of mills, machines, and marketing. Newspapers shouted, "The South will rise again," this time with smokestacks. Atlanta, Birmingham, and Nashville became the proud faces of progress, cities where ambition met humidity and tried not to melt. Textile mills replaced plantations. Railroads stitched together towns like patchwork quilts. And suddenly, the phrase, Southern hospitality became not just a charm, but a business model. But even as the New South boomed, the Old South refused to fade, because you can build skyscrapers on haunted ground. But the whispers still rise through the cracks. For millions of black Southerners, the New South was just the old one with a different accent. Segregation ruled every street corner, every classroom, every train car. Laws called Jim Crow divided the world by color and punished anyone who dared to cross the line. Signs appeared, like scars, white only, colored entrance, separate but equal. A phrase so polite it almost sounded fair, until you looked closer and saw the cruelty beneath. Lynching became both a warning and a ritual. Between 1880 and 1930, thousands were murdered, often in public, often unpunished. The terror wasn't just physical. It was psychological, a reminder that freedom could still be taken back at any moment. And yet, despite the danger, communities endured. Churches became fortresses of faith. Schools became sanctuaries of learning. Music, oh the music, became medicine for the soul. From the pain of the fields and the pews came a sound that changed the world. The blues were born, slow, soulful, tender as heartbreak, and tough as leather boots. In the Mississippi Delta, men with guitars sang of loss and love, of hardship and humor. Blind Lemon Jefferson, Lead Belly, Robert Johnson, who, legend says, sold his soul at a crossroads just to make his guitar weep more beautifully. That music traveled up the river, into Memphis, into Chicago, carrying the heartbeat of the South wherever it went. And, when it met gospel, it gave us soul. When it met jazz, it gave us swing. When it met defiance, it gave us rock and roll. The South, it turned out, could never stay quiet for long. As the music carried the soul, words began to carry the truth. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright began to tell the Southern story from the other side of the color line. Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God" sang of black womanhood with wit and tenderness. Wright's "Native Son and Black Boy" burned through the page with fury and honesty. Later came James Baldwin, who once wrote, To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Yet even Baldwin's rage had rhythm, that calm, patient rhythm of someone who has seen too much and still believes in beauty. Through their words, the South's silence began to crack, quietly at first, then like thunder, before rain. By the B, mid-20th century, the South was once again at the center of a revolution. This time not of bullets, but of bravery. In Montgomery, Alabama, a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. That single act, quiet, polite, stubborn, lit a fuse that reached every corner of the South. A young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward, his voice calm as a lullaby, powerful as prophecy. He spoke of love stronger than hate, of justice rolling down like water, of dreams that still echoed under magnolia trees. From lunch counters to courthouses, from Selma's bridge to Memphis's balcony, the civil rights movement bloomed. Fed by faith, watered by courage, tended by those who had nothing left to lose but their chains. The world watched, and the South, for the first time in a long, journey, began to see itself clearly, even as marches filled the streets. The South remained what it had always been, a land of opposites. Gospel choirs singing next to burning crosses, hospitality and hostility in the same town square. Sunday sermons on love preached beside courthouse laws of hate. It's maddening. It's heartbreaking. It's the South, forever wrestling with its better angels and its oldest demons. But that's what makes it endlessly fascinating. A place where grace is stubborn and hope keeps showing up uninvited. The civil rights victories of the 1960s didn't erase the pain, but they cracked open the door. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, they were more than laws. They were promises that maybe, finally, the South could grow into its own ideals. Change came slowly, unevenly, like a summer storm that skips some towns and floods others. But it came. Black teachers stood at chalkboards once forbidden to them. Black mayors took office in towns once ruled by white-only signs. And young Southerners of every color began to dream beyond the boundaries of the past. Still, the South never lost its contradictions. It's the only place where you can hear a church choir and a rebel yell in the same afternoon. And somehow, both sound like home. Even now, the South is walking that long road toward wholeness. Each generation inherits not just the land, but the stories, some painful, some proud, all intertwined. The magnolias still bloom, the moss still whispers, and the voices that once sang for freedom now sing for understanding, because the Deep South has learned something precious, that to heal, you don't bury your ghosts, you listen to them, you let them speak, and in their stories you find your own redemption. The South has walked through slavery, war, ruin, and rebirth, and still, it sings. It's tired, beautiful, flawed, and full of faith. It's the sound of a people who've been broken but never silenced. Next, we step into the final chapter, where the South at last begins to make peace with its past and discovers that sometimes the truest freedom comes not from forgetting but from remembering kindly. If you listen closely, the Deep South still whispers, not with words but with rhythm. The creak of a porch swing, the sigh of the wind through moss, the far-off whistle of a midnight train. The ghosts are quieter now. The wounds still ache, but they've learned to scar with grace, and the South, for all its contradictions, has become something rare and resilient, a living conversation between what was and what might be. Drive through the modern South, and you'll see it, the past and present sitting side by side like old friends who've learned to stop arguing. In Atlanta, skyscrapers glitter above the same red clay that once stained soldiers' boots. In New Orleans, brass bands march past wrought iron balconies older than the nation's flag. In Charleston, cobblestones meet Teslas, and history nods politely to innovation. It's a region where church bells and hip-hop beats share the same Sunday morning air, where barbecue smoke mingles with startup coffee shops, where small-town courthouses still lean under the weight of bronze soldiers, but murals now bloom beside them, painted by the descendants of those the statues forgot. The Deep South isn't just remembering anymore. It's rewriting. Slowly. Softly. Bravely. In recent years, the South has begun to talk about its ghosts out loud. Statues have come down. Conversations, once whispered, now happen in classrooms, in kitchens, even at family tables. Not everyone agrees on what remembering should look like. Some want to preserve, some want to remove. Most, though, just want to understand. And maybe that's the truest kind of healing. Not the silence of forgetting, but the peace of understanding. Because history doesn't go away when you tear down a monument. It lingers in the soil, in the names, in the stories that refuse to stay buried. The trick is to let those stories live, honestly, humbly, and with heart. The South still sings. Oh, does it ever sing? From Nashville's neon glow to New Orleans street corners, from the Delta blues to Atlanta's trap beats, the South's music has never stopped evolving. It's a chorus of past and present, a symphony of contradictions. Gospel choir belts out hope on Sunday morning. By Friday night, the same spirit dances in a juke joint or a jazz bar. Each note carries centuries, joy and sorrow, faith and fire. You can hear the plantation fields in the blues. You can hear the church pews in country songs. And you can hear the heartbeat of the future in the rhythm of rap. Music has always been the South's truest memory, because you can't argue with a song, you can only feel it. Southern hospitality. It's one of those phrases that makes people smile. And it's real mostly. There's a special warmth down here. An instinct to feed, to welcome, to wave at strangers passing by. But beneath that warmth lies something deeper. A shared understanding that life and history are complicated things. It's why Southerners tell stories the way they do. Slowly, humorously, with pauses between sentences that hold entire centuries. Hospitality here isn't just politeness, it's survival. The art of making peace with your neighbors and your ghosts at the same table. Walk beneath the live oaks in Savannah, and you can feel time move differently. Slow, circular, heavy with memory. The air carries both perfume and history. The land remembers everything. The songs of the enslaved, the thunder of distant battles, the laughter of picnics that came after. You can almost hear the echoes under the moss, the promises, the prayers, the mistakes, the forgiveness. It's why the Deep South feels alive even when it's still. Because here, memory isn't buried, it blooms. Today's South is full of new voices, filmmakers, writers, poets, chefs, musicians, each adding new verses to an ancient song. Jessamine Ward writes of small towns and hurricanes with biblical weight. Yaa Gyasi unravels slavery's legacy through generations. Donald Glover turns Southern surrealism into modern art. And Beyoncé, a Southern woman to her core, reclaims the South's femininity, pain, and pride with golden fire. They all tell the same truth in different tongues, that the South is not a relic. It's a living, breathing contradiction. Where the soil is dark, the light is soft. And the stories never end. The South hasn't solved its past. Perhaps it never will. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the South's redemption lies in its willingness to keep talking, to keep listening, to keep trying. Deepens it. Admit that beauty and pain can share the same song, and that truth doesn't erase love. In a way, the Deep South has always been America's mirror. Look long enough, and you'll see everything. The grace, the guilt, the humor, the hurt. But you'll also see the possibility that even the most complicated story can end with peace. As the night deepens, the air grows still. Somewhere, a screen door creaks, a cricket sings, and the South exhales, weary, wise, and unbroken. The magnolias bloom again, the rivers roll on, and the whispers beneath the moss say not remember me, but learn from me. Because the Deep South, for all its shadows, still shines. Not in spite of its history, but because of it. It has loved, it has lost, it has survived. And it reminds us, softly through moss and magnolia, that no story, no matter how dark, is beyond redemption. Thank you for listening, dreamer. This has been The Deep South, stories whispered through moss and magnolia, a journey through time, tenderness, and truth. If you found calm, or curiosity, or a touch of wonder in this story, don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy Dreamer in America, where history hums you to sleep, one story at a time.